Today I speak with Oliver Traldi. Oliver is a graduate student in the philosophy department at the University of Notre Dame, where he studies logic and epistemology. We speak about a recent piece Oliver wrote for the Bellows website entitled "The Left Has Turned into a Guild Hall." The conversation begins with Oliver defining what he means by, quote, the guild, and then it quickly turns into a discussion about education at elite universities, and then into a conversation of what is called, in online circles, the, quote, woke. Today's conversation ends with a reflection on what could be a commercial drive behind this educational paradigm. As part of that exploration, Oliver and I take up multiple frames of reference, but the one I want to define preemptively is the materialist one. This is a frame that, while not exclusively utilized in this way, is most frequently associated with Karl Marx and Marxism. We use the term rather loosely in our discussion, meaning we are not deriving the discussion from a particular school of thought. We do utilize it consistently to discuss motivations that are derived from material interest instead of from an abstract idea or principle. We then turn our discussion to what is the aim or goal of education, exploring whether a university education should be a mark of refinement, a pathway to employment, or a general kind of education into the human experience. Because of the ambiguity of this question, we then turn to a different one. What is an elite? Or perhaps the equally as important question, what is their role in society? As always, we rarely come to any conclusions, but the questions themselves are fruitful. I thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with Oliver, and I hope you will as well. Hello, Oliver.
Hey, how's it going?
Doing just fine. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Thank you for coming on today and talking about a recent piece of yours on what you call the guild and the education of elites and its relationship to, we can call it in quotes, the woke. And we can get into all of those things here. But I wanted to thank you for coming on and spending some time with me and talking about it. I want to set up a couple of foundations for the piece and ask you sort of how to define certain things. So your piece refers to like the medieval concept of the guild as a way of understanding a particular kind of elite education that is no longer an elite education, but instead is sort of spread into the rest of the culture. So why don't we start with you defining your idea of what the guild is and what it represents and how it's related to an Ivy League education, and we can go from there.
Yeah, so, okay, first question already rather difficult. You know, the idea of the guild, so maybe explaining why I came up with it will help explain what it is. So I had found that my thinking and the thinking of a lot of the people I had been reading about, talking about social justice, orthodoxy, and progressivism, identity politics, and human resources departments in big corporations that police the way that people talk to each other in workplaces and things like that. I had found that there had become this big trend towards talking about it as a kind of new religion, or as this set of ideas that was becoming dominant and just kind of brainwashing everybody. And I was participating in this, but just getting really, really tired of it and just starting to think that I wasn't sure that it really explained that much about what was going on. Among other things, you know, something that I talked about in my review recently of the book by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, and that I've mentioned in some other places, is just that, you know, a lot of the ideas in this arena, critics of them like me just take them to be obviously wrong, but also we see them as being very compelling to a lot of people. And that kind of cries out for explanation. I became interested in more what you might call materialist explanations. I started reading some Marxist critics of identity politics and things like that. And the idea of the guild to me was just a way of trying to integrate, in a sense, these two perspectives and to try to understand why was it that people talked about putting their social justice ideas into practice as what they call doing the work. My friend Oliver Bateman is always saying do the work in this ironic way. And in particular, I kind of took maybe a little bit too much, but I was inspired to write the piece after seeing this video from one of the protests of the Black Lives Matter protests. There's a protester who was yelling at the policeman about that the police school didn't require long enough of an education. And he said that they didn't know enough history to be police officer and things like that. And this took me back to a set of older things I had been concerned with back when I was young and had energy and things like that. When I had just graduated college, I graduated college in 2008, and in a couple short years, I went to a small liberal arts college. I went to Bard College in upstate New York. Everybody was very, very liberal there. I was also very liberal, but I was, a centrist or even a conservative by the standards of my campus because, I was the sort of person who was like a fan of presidential candidates like John Edwards or Dennis Kucinich or people like that, rather than thinking that we should burn things down or incite some kind of socialist revolution or be anarchists. So I was still very institutionalist and not a revolutionary at all. So that made me kind of a conservative by campus standards.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny how that works. And now I have no idea what I am. So a couple of years went by, and a lot of my friends joined the Occupy protests. And I remember reflecting on just some of the things I saw going across social media. So one thing was that a woman who was a couple of years younger than me in college, I remember posting something one summer that said, "Tell me what books I need to read to be a good person this summer. Tell me, how do I educate myself to be a good person? How do I read in a responsible way?" And all the books that were offered were things like Frantz Fanon or, The Anthropology of Whiteness and things like that. Kind of like a proto, it's funny because I saw this as such a fringe idea, but it's very much actually like the anti-racist reading lists, right? That you might see now with Robin DiAngelo and Ibram Kendi's books and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I remember seeing, which I mentioned in the article, was a friend drew this enormous kind of intersectional diagram. There was this critique of Occupy about what is it really about, what topics is it really about, and my friend drew this enormous intersectional diagram of, it's about war, but also about education, but also about the environment, but also about the economy, also about gender, but also about race, and all these things had lines drawn between them and things like that. And it was just this massive, and I had gotten good grades at college, and people thought I was smart. Right. And I looked at this diagram and I just thought, I have no idea. I don't know what this means, right? I don't know what's going on here. I look at this and I find it incomprehensible, right? So that started me thinking, this is around 10 years ago now, that started me thinking about what are the ways in which reading the right sorts of books and understanding the right sorts of kind of advanced, and sort of in a way strange ideas and being able to make sense of certain kinds of tangled and complex documents like this image, what was kind of the impact of conflating that with being either political in the right way or even moral in the right way? Why would people see those things instantly and say, somebody who is able to understand this will be a good person? So in a way, the Guild article was my attempt to go back to those ideas as well, kind of now equipped with this combination of idealist and materialist critiques of identity politics that I'd been reading, and just kind of trying to understand what was the kind of social formation that would lead people to come to this view of, to be a good person, you need to be able to understand a certain, a very specific set of complex ideas in social theory. So I don't know if I've quite answered your question yet. What is the Guild? So that's kind of all background. So what I called the Guild is just a kind of emergent phenomenon of people trying to make sure that that certain kinds of jobs, but eventually all jobs, and that's why the police officer was an interesting example, right? Because it's the kind of, although it's very well paid, it's very much not a job that you associate somebody with a woke college degree being interested in, right?
Right.
So I view this as a phenomenon that's expanding, but the idea is basically people look for ways to explain why you can't be good at this job or you can't do this job in a good or moral way unless you have this certain very specific kind of training that makes you a politically or morally good person that I've been talking about. So some examples that I was thinking about were, of course, college professors are supposed to be trained in this way. Engineers are now supposed to be able to look for various kinds of biases in their algorithms James Damore was ousted for having a certain kind of view at Google. Doctors are supposed to be able to interact with patients in a certain kind of way, and are supposed to have progressive politics or are supposed to be conversant with this sort of social theory in order to make sure that they deal equitably with patients of different backgrounds. Probably you see something similar for lawyers. And so the idea is that the guild is not like a normal guild in that there's not really one thing that it produces. It's not the group of people who do your plumbing or who make things out of wood or who make computers or anything like that.
Right.
The idea is that for any job like that, eventually this group will innovate a way of looking at it such that it requires being conversant in the sort of social theory and the sort of social analysis that was involved in this enormous document that I can't stop thinking about from 10 years ago, or that is implicit in the question of what do I need to read in order to be a good person? And then the answer is a bunch of anthropology texts and things like that.
Oh, so if I can interrupt you for just a second, this is, it's leading me to a couple of other follow-up questions. So I'm the first person in my family that graduated from high school. And so I went to a local commuter college. These theories showed up in like sociology, but as a theory, it wasn't, it's one of many, sort of a pluralist way of approaching it, which struck me and still strikes me as probably the appropriate way to teach these things.
I would think so, yeah.
But then afterwards, then going into graduate school, you get more and more exposures to certain things, and especially if you're on the internet. But these really start out as phenomenon among elites and in the Ivy League. And so a question that I've constantly had and would be curious to know your reflection on, is this something where there was something about the way Ivy League students or the kind of students that are drawn to the Ivy League or accepted at the Ivy League were primed for this kind of guildship sense of themselves? You are part of the elite if you speak in this way, and if you don't, you are not. And that this is a line of demarcation that was particularly apt for elite universities. Or the other way perhaps of framing it would be, is this a reflection of the ethos of those kinds of universities? Or is the system of thinking designed to change the ethos of those kinds of people so that it can be distributed across the system, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I mean, my view, probably unsurprisingly, at least to the last question, my view is the cynical one. In a prior piece, in 2017, I wrote a piece called something like political correctness as a class mechanism. So my view there I was a little bit more in the shadow of the Trump election and things like that. But there, what I argued was something like, political correctness is a way, among other things, is a way to just justify why some people who don't have the things that you have don't deserve them, right? So the idea of an undeserving poor, right? Well, they don't deserve it because they're not good, and they're not good because they kind of can't speak in this way and can't understand these sorts of theories and things like that.
Right.
So that, I think, to answer that question, I have the cynical view that this is not really transformative in that way. Obviously there are other ways in which arguably transformative. I mean, it's hard to say. There are definitely people who have these views who believe, for instance, that, some people think that a lot of, people will say a lot of things, right? There are people who think that, Ivy League schools should be nationalized by the government, and that admission should be determined by lot or something like that, right?
Very democratic, right?
Yeah. Or I've seen people say, all the Ivy League schools shouldn't be allowed to admit white people or something in order to redress centuries of racial imbalances or something.
Right.
So obviously those would be transformative proposals. So I'm not trying to say that there are no transformative proposals from people in this sector, but I think the effect is not a transformative one. The effect I take to be largely kind of a projection of the elite power of these institutions.
I've been thinking a lot about Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind, from the late 80s. It strikes me that he's talking about similar kind of phenomena that are going on then, which you would have in an elite university in the late 80s. And it makes me wonder if what we're in essence doing is changing the language of elites from going, where you can talk about Plato's, the Theaetetus or whatever, and you can go on about these textual analysis, to now the language that you're speaking in is of white fragility and of white privilege and of these other language. But in essence, it's the same kind of people talking about, just the content has changed, but the people are functionally the same.
Yeah, I definitely think that there's an exclusivity that remains, and there's a sort of absurdity to, I think there's, I think the Theaetetus is a great text, and I think it holds up very well against anything by Robin DiAngelo. Let's just be clear on that.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
There's a sort of absurdity to, well, there's an old Onion video that goes well with a lot of this. The joke is like a trucker explaining how he was a Trump voter, but then he read Judith Butler, and now he sees the error of his ways, and he's just saying, "Oh, I didn't realize that I was performing my masculinity." And then he looks at the ground and shakes his head, and then he spouts a bunch of, "I was being so heteropatriarchal" or whatever, and it's just it's rather absurd, right? So yeah, I agree that there's been a replacement of one canon with another, and there's a lot that's kind of supposed to be taken for granted in what texts people have read, and they're different texts than might have been there a couple decades ago. The other thing I want to say is that this is something that I was trying to think to your question of what distinguishes an Ivy League school from a community school in this regard. I can't say anything too authoritatively. I didn't attend either one, right? I attended a sort of in between, expensive, private, very, very left-wing liberal arts college that maybe didn't have the virtues of either an Ivy League school or a commuter school. Maybe like the worst of both worlds in a way, although I loved it there, but for other reasons than this. I tend to think that it's not just what goes on in the classroom. Yeah. I think that there's a sense in which students are maybe encouraged to view their experiences and articulate their experiences to each other in terms of these theories and in terms of the language that I call the guild language and the guild concepts. When you see the demands that came out in the protests in 2015, 2016, the last wave of protests, the pre-Trump BLM and campus protests, and the way people describe, you're invalidating my existence, you're erasing my identity, things like that. Yep. Those are not phrases. I mean, just to be clear, those are not phrases that if you wrote them, some postmodern sociology professor is not going to read those phrases and immediately think, oh, like this makes a lot of sense. I know what this means, right? Like even the most, even the most kind of progressively oriented professor in one of these, things that I think of as a guild field is going to read these things and kind of maybe have some questions about what exactly is indicated about them, or by them, I mean. So I think there's this other side of it that is sort of what some people think of as like the Tumblrification of campus politics or something like that, right? Which is just less to do with learning this language and more to do with beginning to articulate your own experiences and your own interests in the terms of this language, knowing which metaphors are okay to use and knowing who is allowed to say what and things like that. When Nick Christakis was surrounded by the protesters at Yale, after his wife had written, this is 5 years ago now, but his wife had written this thing about why the school shouldn't have rules about whether people can wear sombreros on Halloween of all things. And Nick Christakis was out there kind of defending her, and they surrounded him and they said, we're dying out here. Now we're in a situation where right now, if a college student came to me and said, we're dying out here, I would assume they meant of COVID.
Right. A literal sense.
There may be a literal sense in which college students may die this semester. But that sense when they said they're dying out here, there was some kind of metaphor. Maybe it was from James Baldwin or maybe by the way of Ta-Nehisi Coates or something like that. But there was a sense in which the metaphor was licensed by the use of this person. So that's just a long way. And this, of course, was true of other forms of elite organization that you would have seen and still is. How do people know, why is it that Ivy Leaguers are going to do a better job preparing for interviews at consulting firms and investment banking firms and things like that.
Right.
Than people at other schools. Part of it is probably what they learn in the classroom, but a lot of it is going to do with what sorts of conversations they have with their peers and what sorts of aid they get from administrators, and just sort of the general campus culture, knowing friends with parents who work at those sorts of places.
Right.
So there's a lot that just has to do with the milieu. And I don't know if I've done a great job kind of piecing apart those different variables, but I definitely think that there's a kind of holistic picture of what somebody learns from attending these institutions that is not just going to a classroom and being brainwashed by some caricature of a Marxist professor. You know, the Marxist professor is often going to be the person who kind of is problematizing these ideas to students who then, you know, refuse to let them be problematized. So.
Right. I can't get past that image, the Christakis image of, you know, we're dying out here. As an example, I haven't spent a lot of time with Foucault. I've spent enough time with Foucault that I don't want to spend a whole lot more time with Foucault unless I have to.
Yeah.
But that's sort of what is going on here is there's a kind of internalizing existence as a form of narrative or discourse. Mm-hmm. So if one is silent, one doesn't exist, as a kind of literal meaning of the word idiot. If one does not speak, one is an idiot, going all the way back to its Greek foundation. You know,
right.
It's foolish. You weren't smart enough to speak or had nothing worthwhile to say. Mm-hmm. And this is almost a counter reaction to that. You know, you're not going to assert that I don't exist or that I'm foolish because I'm always engaged in my own sort of narrative. That's not really something that, like, someone fundamentally from a working class background, they're never going to arrive at that. Mm-hmm. What's going to keep me from existing? Not being able to pay my rent or buy food, not speaking. That's like, it's just not high on the priority list. And so that's what's constantly made me think about, and your point about elite universities, as someone who stumbled my way into the academy and looking around, what is the greatest benefit of studying? Like, several of my professors have come from Notre Dame or Rutgers or, you know, these other places. What's the biggest thing that they have going for them that, let's say, a first generation student at a local community college doesn't have? They don't have a network, those kids. And like, that's in essence why your piece resonated so much with me, and the idea of a guild. I always thought of it more like a secret society, but it's the same. It's the same idea. That,
the secret society also is something they have a lot of at Yale.
And that you have to know the handshake, and you have to know which fork to eat at dinner, and you have to have all of these other things. Here, it's in the way that you perform on camera, and the language that you're using, and it very much is an indication of class. But it has. To think that the Christakis thing was only 5 years ago, it feels like it may have been when World War II happened, you know, that the cultural landscape shifts so radically, so quickly, which may actually indicate sort of an instantiation of the ideas outside of the class, which may be showing why there's so much more conflict about it. Because no longer is it just a demarcation that, you know, I went to Harvard or I went to Yale or whatever. It's not nearly the materialist boost that it once was. And so now there's this, you know, internecine warfare that's going on.
Yeah. So, you said a lot of things so one thing you said was about the, you know, the forks and all that. Yeah, I think, you know, to an extent, I think a lot of this there's a kind of patina of morality, but a lot of it is a complex etiquette. That was kind of one of the first frames I had for thinking about this, again, a few years ago. Thinking about college as a kind of finishing school, like a political finishing school or something.
Which was always their role for a long time.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, these are traditional roles, finishing school and, you know, religious training, things like that.
Right.
I think that anybody who's made a faux pas talking about these topics kind of understands intuitively the sense in which they might be about etiquette rather than about morality, right? You can kind of say the same thing in almost the same way and get very different reactions just based on what you emphasize or who you're saying it to or something like that. There are rules about who gets to speak first and things like that, all these complex oppression Olympics type things.
Well, certainly a hierarchy of priority. We could use the language of privilege, right? Something like this, that where you sit relative to the hierarchy determines your the importance of your narrative.
Yeah. Yeah, and the narrativizing itself is interesting because there's even a relationship to this narrativizing impulse to kind of the rise of social media and the way that people have to present themselves kind of in the broader culture. The sort of story that you have to be able to tell about yourself to get certain kinds of jobs. You know, it's not as much anymore a story about here are the skills that I have. It's more of a story about here are the obstacles that I've faced, you know, here are the ways in which, here are the things I've had to overcome. And that's sort of the language that is taught to you in this atmosphere on a college campus. The last thing that you said that I wanted to respond to, okay, you talked about it being a kind of network. We talked about it being a kind of etiquette.
And the internecine warfare that's going on.
Right,
no longer a
exactly.
useful tool or demarcation.
Right, exactly. And that's where the idea of overproduction to me came in, because this was sort of the thing that this was the sort of thing that put together some of these ideas for me, because I was thinking about this, and I don't know if I like the term cancellation anymore. I've written about it a bit, or cancel culture, but I was thinking about just this aspect of cancel culture, which is basically that it involves people losing their jobs, right? And jobs are pretty hard things to come by these days. So the idea of cancellation that you can't, I mean, so obviously sometimes it's for you know, things that would have been problematic, you know, in the 1990s or even the 1950s, but often if somebody's canceled, it's for not kind of keeping up with the right sorts of norms that have changed very recently, or not understanding that the norms of their campus are now the norms of their work. Norms that were first on Tumblr are now norms of college campuses, and those become norms of workplaces, elite workplaces like Google. So there's a kind of encouragement that way.
Well, and increasingly more so even outside of the elite workforces.
Right, exactly, yeah. Which is what, you know, the idea of this protester yelling at the police officers for not understanding, you know, not being able to read Ta-Nehisi Coates or whatever. And so I just started trying to take seriously this fact that people were losing their jobs, and people are trying to redistribute, you know, jobs to people who have more training in these kinds of things.
It's a very Marxist interpretation, right?
Yeah, so this is me trying to be a bit of a materialist, and maybe in this article, you know, some people criticized it for being a little too materialist, and it's something I was new at. I think I kind of, I was maybe a little coarse-grained or something.
But it certainly has its utility, you know?
Yeah, and I think this, you know, this analysis in terms of if you're having trouble finding a job, or if you're having trouble moving up in your workplace, you know, think about what's happening at the New York Times, right? You have all these young reporters, or at least this was Barry Weiss's interpretation. It's probably not quite as clear-cut as she put it, because she's kind of a simplifier in the way that she puts things, but I've heard sort of similar things at other media outlets. Mm-hmm. So the idea is basically you have a bunch of these young reporters who've been trained not just in these things as academic, you know, as we've been talking about, right? Who've been trained to talk this way, not just academically, but also socially, also talk about themselves in world events these ways. And then they're up against kind of the older, kind of implacable, centrist, center-left, liberal leadership of these institutions. You know, the James Bennett types. James Bennett being the guy who was ousted from the New York Times, right?
Right.
There's not much opportunity for advancement, or they hit a plateau, or they're not getting to write the sorts of stories they want, or something like that. And so one mode of organizing and trying to improve their lot in the workplace, or of one mode of somebody outside the workplace trying to move in, is just to say, is to organize around these things and say, look at how problematic these people are, to try to cancel the people who aren't speaking this language. And then if a workplace, if somebody is canceled and loses their job for not being able to speak in guild terms, as I would put it, not being able to articulate their own experiences or other people's experiences using the sort of language we've talked about, then the natural thing is to replace them with somebody who can speak that way, right? Somebody who won't be canceled, somebody who's not offensive in this way. And so it's kind of just a reorganization of who gets to work where. The natural thing, and I think you don't see this everywhere, but I think you start to see, and these are kind of the ones that I find fun to watch. The natural thing is when you start to have kind of people who entered institutions for that reason, then being the ones who are starting to be thrown out for not being sufficiently, you know, able to speak the guild language and things like that. And that's always, of course, you know, internal witch hunts of that type are not exclusive to progressives. No. And they're not, you know, you don't need to give them a materialist analysis, right? Like conservatives have these same sorts of witch hunts. I call it scum hunting, which is a term from the party game Mafia. So in a lot of these things, I don't know if the materialist analysis, maybe it obscures in some cases and illuminates in others. But yeah, I think the internecine aspect of it is really interesting. One thing that I find funny, so I'm just this is somebody who I don't want to attack because she already gets enough grief, but a funny example is somebody like Nicole Hannah-Jones at the New York Times, who spearheaded the 1619 Project.
Right.
Now, Nicole Hannah-Jones is somebody who is actually not at all, it's obvious that her work is somehow related to guild projects. The 1619 Project is an obviously, like, if there is a guild in the way that I'm talking about, it's a guild-inflected idea. But she herself is, like, constantly kind of denigrating the oppression that like, non-black minorities have faced, and talking about how, Native Americans didn't have to deal with what black people had to, and Hispanics didn't have to deal with what black people had to, and Asian Americans don't experience racism and stuff like that. And it is constantly stepping in it with regards to these things. So that's something that I always found interesting. That's something where it's like, I don't think she's somebody who can be removed for guild reasons. I think that sometimes hiring somebody for guild reasons it's sort of like a glitch. Hiring somebody for these sorts of reasons does not actually always lead to somebody who's good at performing it. In a way, like, Nicole Hannah-Jones is a more authentic hire and a less cynical hire for the New York Times for guild reasons than somebody who actually performs progressive pieties better.
The claim that she's making there, that there's a unique claim to be made by African Americans, particularly African Americans that are descendants of slavery, since it was the unique experience of race slavery in America. There is something certainly compelling about the argument for that there's a unique experience there. But I think the contradiction you're pointing to is when you put things in questions of a univariable experience, oppression, then it actually is going to corrode the special claim that you can make for African Americans and their oppression. It flattens, it levels those things out. And it's interesting to watch her have to wrestle with that. Because I think on the one hand, I'm deeply sympathetic to the argument of the unique experience of black people in America. But on the other hand, the argument that you're using is going to fundamentally undermine that special claim.
I certainly agree with everything you said. I think I was thinking of it more on kind of less on an interesting level and more on the kind of social level of etiquette, like we were talking about.
Yeah.
So I think just in terms of the etiquette, kind of like palpably, Nicole Hannah-Jones doesn't do well with her progressive friends when she says these things about, like, Native Americans haven't had to deal with this, or Hispanic people haven't had to deal with this. That's just sort of, I just take that to be kind of like a fact of, like, the Twitter ratios and things like that.
That leads me to an interesting question that, as someone who is studying logic and epistemology, I actually think these things, my knowledge of 20th century epistemology extends to how much my wife has taught me. She has a master's degree in philosophy, so I have, let's call it, third-hand knowledge. We basically spend most of our time arguing through slogans now, and slogans are the most reductive way of having an argument possible. I mean, they're very poor heuristics. But the slogans are also, at least in the way that I've seen them used, are extensions of label construction. It's a manifestation. We've created a category and applied a name to it, and then we're going to generate a particular slogan to advocate for a particular thing for that category. So the question, sort of fundamentally, that I want to get at, do you think there's a useful distinction to be made, one, between a slogan and its root as in a label? Like, if you understand what I'm asking there.
Can you give me an example of the sort of label you have in mind?
Well, so there was just the big kerfluffle about capitalizing the letter B for black.
Oh, yeah.
And
okay,
which is really speaking to a question of label and category. But then there's obviously slogans that are directly connected to the use of that, a capital B or not a capital B. And so is the distinction there one that's useful? And perhaps we can apply some of these logical structures to maybe taking apart some of that. And then there's the, again, perhaps maybe less interesting question is, how useful is it where in this situation, and she presents a very good example of this, where if you're trying to parse out and make special claims based on historical experience or even empirical evidence, we don't even need to go down that road, but we could say even using it, that when you're reducing things down into consumable chance, you're going to lose basically all of the nuance. By definition, you have to, because your goal is not teaching, it's activism.
Yeah.
And I want to plumb that one a little bit more too, because I think that's one of the things you raise, and I would love to, since we are both products of North American graduate schools, I think it would be it could be very useful for us to think about the distinction there. But first, can we start on sort of like a question of, I suppose, semiotics of symbolism and these questions of labels and slogans that derive from them?
Yeah, so I think the place I want to start is I want to acknowledge this sort of tension. Nobody else, I always have this fear that people are going to see like the tensions and contradictions in my thinking and really challenge me on them. But like nobody actually cares that much what I say. So I kind of have to do it to myself. So a tension in my thinking is that I'm very defensive of people's ability to use heuristics. I think, heuristics help a lot of people do reasoning. And so, for example, there was recently this thing on Twitter of somebody got angry. She was at a restaurant and it was like she ordered a steak and her boyfriend ordered a salad, and the waiter switched the orders or something like that.
Yeah, right.
Maybe that was somebody else's example. Maybe they got drinks. She ordered a whiskey on the rocks and he ordered like a pink margarita, and they switched the drinks or something like that.
Sure.
And I just think that that I think in a way is just more guild signaling. It's just more people saying, I'm smart enough that I don't need heuristics in order to understand the world, right? Like you plebs, you don't have enough working memory to deal with all these orders. It's yet more guild stuff that like, oh, maybe you can't be a waiter unless you have deprogrammed yourself at an elite American university. Like maybe that's where we're going, that you can't even serve tables unless you've taken courses in sociology and anthropology.
Right.
Okay, so that's probably enough for me talking about this specific example. But the tension is that I'm very in favor of heuristics and very against slogans, but you might think that they're kind of like the same thing. So there's sort of a tension in my thinking there. Now that I've acknowledged it, I'm not going to talk about it anymore. I think that the relationship between slogans and identity categories is an interesting one. I think there was a time when compelling political slogans wouldn't have referred so directly to identity categories because it wouldn't have been, at least in the areas of politics that I was involved in, we would have had a liberal universalism rather than the progressive particularism.
Right.
Or you would have had a Marxist universalism.
Right.
But the progressive kind of identity particularism, I take to be, I don't know enough about history to say it's new. I'm imagining all the people who might DM me if I say it's new and say, Oliver, it's not new, read these things. Haven't you read the things that were assigned that would make you a good person in your anthropology classes?
Well, I think we could... I think we could safely say that it is out of the norm of the past century. Whether it's new in all of human experience, it's certainly a different phenomenon from the aspiration of the society for the past century.
I take it to be a kind of development, at least.
Yeah.
And so you get, two great examples are like the Black Lives Matter slogan and the Believe Women slogan, right?
Right.
The Believe Women slogan is a slogan I wrote it after Tara Reid accused Joe Biden of some sort of sexual assault that I'm ashamed to say I don't remember the details of. There were all these pieces about like, oh, we didn't really mean believe women, or like, oh, we didn't really mean believe women.
Interesting how the emphasis is different there, right?
Yeah, so there were people who were like figuring out different ways to anti-parse it, to obfuscate it. But it was obvious what it meant. Everybody knew what it meant until they didn't know what it meant anymore. And then with Black Lives Matter, you have the whole Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter thing. So it's interesting to me what you say. Basically, it's interesting to me that slogans, it's taken to have a certain prestige to phrase your political slogan in terms of identity categories, whereas at some point that might have been seen as divisive or something like that. That speaks to guild training, right? People understand now that it's actually in the relevant circles, which is not like people who vote, but it's like people who decide who's going to work at the New York Times.
Right. The gatekeepers are the gatekeepers.
Yeah.
Right.
The gatekeepers generally are going to see that as having a certain kind of prestige rather than as being divisive. Yeah. So that's my reaction to that. Did that answer, is that kind of relevant?
I think I'm going to, but I think it makes me want to push the door on it a little bit further. So I've been trained broadly in the history of political philosophy. And so I don't have nearly the the training in logic and metaphysics and epistemology and the other stuff that, and I'll put this in quotes, the serious philosophers do. I would take umbrage with this, but, it's fine. I think what sort of animates or what drew me to the piece beyond its materialist critique, which I think I very much see evidence for. So whether it's true in the particulars, I think it's true in the spirit. But it's really a kind of training in hermeneutics. And so the importance of sloganeering is really the extension of how do you apply hermeneutics to politics. I think that's what's generating this perpetual conflict of slogan and slogan and slogan to the point where some of them almost get reduced to meaninglessness. Cancel culture is a really good example of this, I think. It just means someone's in opposition to me and there's someone that's screaming about it. That's not what it meant. But as the hermeneutics have been applied to it, it sort of is parsed out and destroyed into meaninglessness. And so I think what I was sort of getting at and was wondering what your thoughts are, if it is a kind of training in hermeneutics, and I'm sure people will yell and scream that's not what it is, but I think as someone who's been trained in some ways of thinking as a postmodernist without spending a lot of time studying them, that hermeneutics, especially as it's connected to these questions of narrative, slogans stop being just slogans for movements, but they become an extension of the identity. And so why is it traced back to the original category? Because sort of your sense of self as projected through the narrative is. So, and I guess where I'm sort of walking or working through some of this, the means of producing identity are also the means of undoing it. Right, the hermeneutics lead you to construct these identities, but then also are the things that can destroy them, because hermeneutics is a tool, not an end. What is so interesting to me and sort of what we see highlighting that tension there, it's probably why there's always calamity surrounding these things that are arguing about identity politics and, to put it in your language, people who are on the borders of the guild, because the membrane is so permeable because it's a tactic. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, you had a lot of great thoughts that I was kind of trying to figure out how I felt about as you were saying them. I definitely think, I never know exactly what counts as hermeneutics and what doesn't. I definitely think that there's a certain way of looking at language and at people's use of language, which is broadly related to what's sometimes called the hermeneutics of suspicion, which has currency, obviously, in guild training. And it's related to sloganeering, but is a kind of it's almost like the funhouse mirror image of sloganeering, where it's like, you didn't realize it, but you were also sloganeering, right? You were taught certain slogans by your culture, and you don't even really know what you're saying or what's going through your own head, right? So that's, in a way, that's what the guild education, that's part of where it draws its prestige from, right? You say, oh, I grew up with you. I went to the same high school as you, but then you went to community college and you learned like welding or whatever. And I went to an Ivy League school and I learned, whatever the skill crap is that we're talking about. And now the skill that I have is that I can explain how, the things that we thought were natural growing up are actually part of this social script of the patriarchy or of white supremacy or whatever. And the things that seem intuitive and commonsensical are actually slogans in themselves, right? So I think that the idea of a slogan is interesting, and the idea of a heuristic is interesting to think about what the guild does with them, because I think the idea is to sort of break them all down, or at least to break certain ones down, and develop a prestige around the idea of not having to use them because they all have these problematic ideologies where we find a way to trace them back to these overarching social structures that we don't like. So I think there's kind of a broad way of looking at the world there. And I get into this stuff mainly in philosophy. It's funny, analytic philosophy is funny because analytic philosophy is, in terms of content, quickly kind of wokeifying, and people are quickly starting to write about a lot of these topics. And I get a lot of low-hanging fruit because I get response papers to write, against the bad writing on these topics. But analytic philosophers, the culture of analytic philosophy is definitely still, people outside analytic philosophy will not find us woke, because we still talk, even though most woke people still talk in terms of arguments and in terms of stances and in a kind of technical way and still make like very concrete objections and don't see themselves as joiners and things like that. So there's a sort of analytic philosophy personality that's a little bit resistant, even among the most woke analytic philosophers. But some of what I think of as woke and analytic philosophy, or as guild-related and analytic philosophy, is an increasing view of language as not being a way of expressing propositions. People don't use language to say how they feel about things, but instead to kind of try to get in each other's heads. You know, you might not realize it, but when somebody says this, they're dog whistling or code switching or something like that. There are these unconscious processes that are going on. There are implicit biases that are being drawn on, or somebody might be being dehumanized, right? Or your ideology might be activated or something. There's all these complex cognitive models about, oh, this word activated this frame of thinking about this thing, and suddenly you made this judgment based on it. And, you know, so none of it was rational at all, right?
Right.
So this is kind of the direction in which a lot of things are going. And I think that from that perspective, you might think that being into these very reductive slogans is not so bad if your starting point is just like, it's better than being tricked into thinking that there was something else other than a slogan, right? It's better than thinking that there was just these common sense, intuitive notions that we could draw upon that didn't have political content and that weren't slogans of a certain kind. But actually, you know, it turns out, mind blown, you know, exploding brain meme. Turns out it's all slogans all the way down, right? So this is sort of what's supposed to be the mind blowing lesson of some of this stuff, I think.
Yeah, and it strikes me that
and just to be clear, that's a picture of language. I resist that picture. That's a picture of language.
So what's so interesting to me is if anybody takes up the genealogy of morals from Nietzsche, and which in essence this is perhaps why I don't spend or give enough time to postmodernists, because I've read their biblical text in Nietzsche. Mm-hmm. And so as you break that down, you basically understand, or at least in the application of it, I think Nietzsche is very difficult to understand. Let's just put a hard stop right there. But if you're going to take it and say you do understand something and then can apply him somewhere, right? The application presumes a knowledge of the thing. That everything is just ultimately going to be reduced down, as is laid out in a lot of these discussions on postmodernism, to questions of power and all the rest of it. But what it doesn't necessarily, or it hasn't really done for me, or I should say, let me phrase it this way, why I have yet to find most of these criticisms terribly persuasive is, on the one hand, there is very much a attempt to undermine systems that are deemed inequitable. But the system that's going to replace it is fundamentally driven by the exact same principles of the system that is inequitable. Mm-hmm. And by this, I mean, I don't know of any of these people that are making criticisms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, like the gold standard for a liberal document of principles, and has been agreed to as such, and basically emerges as a kind of cobbling together of pieces of American political thought, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, and some German idealism. Mm-hmm. And so if you dig into perhaps under the narrative stuff and all the rest of it, what are the fundamental principles that's animating your behavior? How is that radically different than the systems that have emerged out of these principles? And what I tend to find is most people haven't thought either very seriously about it or get really pissed if you ask them that question. Because it, again, sort of goes against, you would have to just say that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is just another form of narrative, which means it's not true, which means that human beings don't fundamentally have human rights, which means the entire operation of this sort of cosmopolitan criticism that's part and parcel of this whole system, at least is my read of it, is not just self-defeating, it's like, let's put it like in a Hegelian voice, it's self-dissolving. All it takes is 15 seconds of reading it, and it just poofs.
Yeah, so I definitely agree that this is something, this goes back to like the Chomsky-Foucault debate, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so Chomsky was like, well, surely we're like into this leftist stuff because we think it's right and we think it's just, right? And Foucault was just like, no. Like rightness and justice are just more oppressive systems, right? You know, it's irresoluble. It's just, you know, it's something that should be taken more seriously than it is, I think.
Well, and it highlights in some ways that problem that you get from someone like Rousseau. If one is forced to be free, what's the point of freedom? And it kind of leaves you for a yearning of a a non-free person who's actually free prior to politics or post-politics, right? Where you get caught in this very goofy contradiction. I would assert that most of these people aren't reading Rousseau very correctly, to give a little bit of support to my French friend here. But that's sort of where it's coming from. There's a critique that any form of power is inherently going to be illegitimate. It's just sort of who is in charge of it, I guess.
But I think of this as, I want to return to the Guild, because I think of, in a way, this is grist for the mill for the materialist viewpoint. Because when we try to think about what's going on, we're trying to think about what's going on. We've just been talking about in an idealist sense, and we're trying to think, how can we make this coherent? How can we make this critique of kind of all systems of morality that's framed in terms of justice? How can we make that not contradict itself? And it's very difficult. Like there's just no, I don't think anybody's done it, right? So now,
right,
if we flip it and try to think about it materialistically, well, then we say, oh, okay, so what is really needed here is that people want a job to do. People want to have things to publish about. People want to have things to organize around. People want to have a use for their skills that will be kind of a way to garner gainful employment and a way to garner social prestige and maintain relationships and maybe get a leg up on other people and kick other people out of various positions. Well, if that's the case, it's a feature and not a bug that when you replace something, you will then have to replace what you replaced it with as well. Something like the euphemism treadmill that Steven Pinker talks about. So Steven Pinker is like, why are we coming up with all these euphemisms for things? You're just going to throw out the euphemism next, right? The euphemism, if people don't like people of a certain group, whatever nice name you come up with them will turn into a slur and you'll have to come up with another one. Well, it's a feature and not a bug for people who are really good at learning new words and remembering to use them, right? If your skill is learning new forms of linguistic etiquette and imposing them on other people, then the euphemism treadmill is great news for you, right? From a materialist standpoint, where we're thinking about what your interests are, rather than, again, materialist. I'm using the term. I'm not a materialist. I know nothing about class analysis. I'm not good at these things. I'm just talking about when we're thinking about what people's interests are, as opposed to trying to think about whether their ideas cohere.
Yeah, well, and
so
it's not. Well, it's not terribly far that, let's say, like built-in redundancy in your oven or your car or your cell phone. Like there's a shelf life to this thing, and the engines, and this will drive our materialist friends nuts, but the engines of capitalism require this, a perpetual sense of demand for the product that you're making. Well, how do you do it? You make sure that they have to replace it every 3 or 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, it's planned. It's basic planned obsolescence, right? Yep, it's what my dad says about everything. He says it's a racket. Yeah. He says computers are a racket and cell phone chargers are a racket, and cars and houses are a racket because you always have to replace parts and buy new things and stuff like that. And everything is kind of meant to break. Right. If we think of progressive pieties as products, then yeah, they're meant to break and you have to learn new ones and you have to keep up with your trainings. You have to buy the next, who knows who's going to be the, Ibram Kendi maybe is the new Ta-Nehisi Coates. I think probably, I would go with Coates between the two of them. But, then again, I didn't like Coates that much either. So who knows? In 2025, there will be a new orthodoxy on race. There will be a new form of feminism, and everybody will have to learn the new terminologies and the new arguments, right? There's always going to be a demand for these things, and the demand is created through the moralizing of the education. I think the reason that there's always demand, it goes back to my friend from Facebook who said, what do I have to read in order to be a good person, right? And the flip side of that is, how good a person do I have to be in order to get a job and not be canceled from it and things like that, and increasingly to maintain social status as well, because again, when I say materialist, I just mean in terms of people's interests. People have social and romantic interests as well, right? And I get a lot of messages saying, Oliver, I agree with the things you write, but let me tell you, when I'm on a date with a girl, I'm gonna, pretend that I'm into all the progressive stuff because, you need to talk in this way in order to date, in big cities and stuff like that. And so I think in that sense, the contradictions are not so bad, right? It's not so bad if ultimately, here's another example that always bugs me. There's an old, there's a non-woke definition of racism where it's just like people's thoughts and actions that have to do with thinking one racial group is inferior to another racial group. That's like the psychological definition. Nobody likes the psychological definition anymore, but there's like 6 different replacements for it that are all like mutually inconsistent, right? One of them has to do with, racism is a theory that was developed in the Enlightenment, or racism is bad effects of any action that has to do with this or that, or racism is institutions in a society or something like that, or it's structural or it's systemic or this other thing, or it could be implicit and not conscious or something like that. There's a new psychological version with the implicit stuff, there's a historical version, there's a political version, there's a sociological version, stuff like that. So all these definitions don't go together, but again, that's a feature and not a bug if what you're good at is learning a bunch of different definitions and deploying them kind of tactically as the situation requires. So yeah, I think that one thing, this way of looking at things, it should make us reflect a bit more on like what sorts of arguments we think are really important. Because it's sort of like these definitions of racism are inconsistent. Before I started thinking in this way, I would have thought that was like, oh, this is a knockdown argument that anybody who's into this sort of stuff, if they really read it closely and if they're convinced, they'll sort of modify their thinking on these issues. Now, when I think about it in terms of what's the interest in having mutually inconsistent definitions of racism that everybody nonetheless needs to learn and to be able to deploy in the right sort of kind of guild appropriate way. Now I think that argument is not going to make a dent. Because maybe this is Marxist. If I'm thinking, it's not going to affect people's interests, and so we're not going to affect the distribution of definitions of racism unless we affect people's interests in some way. And I'll probably keep making arguments like that just because that's what people pay me for.
Yeah.
But now that I think, when I think about things in these terms, I don't have the same sort of expectation that'll move the needle. That used to be a hope of mine. I've become a little bit more pessimistic, I guess. This kind of connects back to what we were talking about, people framing their social experiences in these terms on college campuses and learning that on college campuses. I think people also learn to do that in online journalism and things like that. And my view of, there was this old site, Everyday Feminism, maybe it's still up. My view of a site like Everyday Feminism, and this is, again, similar sort of change. I used to think, this is like, it's like a clearinghouse for like, way dumbed down and simplified versions of feminist theory from college campuses. Not what I think anymore. What I think now is like what you get on Everyday Feminism, it's just like a set of tools that are meant to be deployed in very specific contexts, right? Like if you don't get a raise, you might use an argument from Everyday Feminism in order to explain to your boss why it's sexist for you not to get a raise. Or if you're having an argument with your boyfriend, you might deploy an argument from Everyday Feminism in order to win that argument in that very specific scenario. So I think a lot of the time, and I think there's another mistake that kind of the more idealist or ideological analysis of what I think now of as being more guild stuff gets wrong. A lot of the time it's not about kind of an overarching background view that people develop kind of along, what you might call woke or identity politics oriented lines. A lot of the time, it's more a way of advancing interests, even in very, very narrow circumstances, and just developing a sort of rhetorical jiu-jitsu that has a certain kind of cultural currency.
So that's so interesting. It leads me to sort of 3 reflections. Mm-hmm. One I got from reading your review of the Lindsay Pluckrose book, that postmodernism sort of as a catch-all phrase may be better understood as the American, perhaps analogous one would be the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debates at the founding of the country. The Anti-Federalists weren't really a thing. They were a loose collection of people that just stood in opposition to something else. And that perhaps postmodernism really is a kind of anti-federalist kind of catch-all phrase where it's there's a whole lot of diversity within it, but it's a useful rhetorical tool to put it as, this over here.
Yeah.
But what it also made me think about is, because the way you're describing this almost sounds like a truncated form of American pragmatism, that it's not necessarily just materialist, but it's practical. In order to play the landscape as it's been set up by these elites, whether it's through their overproduction or the cynical use of these theories or whatever the cause is, the point is, how do you navigate the landscape? And of course, I think American pragmatism at its core still fundamentally believes in liberalism at its heart. So it's not a perfect one-to-one, because I don't think pragmatism is literally just like whatever works. I think there's there's some constraints to it. But perhaps this is the attempt to navigate some of that is through this sort of, and why it would make sense that the taking of these French schools of thinking, which are really taking German schools of thinking, but we don't need to go into all this. But that when you import it into America, what you're really doing is also you're bringing forth that sort of inherent pragmatism that Americans all share. And that the system doesn't have to be coherent. The arguments don't have to be coherent, because that's not the point. The point is this sort of pragmatic approach, this application to the market as you see it, because Americans just really tend not to be terribly idealistic.
Yeah.
Even their academics or not, there is this sort of, whether it's materialist in the Marxist sense or materialist in, let's say, the Adam Smith or Lockean sense, there's still an animation that's going on there of practical concern. So I just sort of wanted to lay that out. People can chew on it, and you can,
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a natural. I'll just be brief in my response, but I think there's a natural fit between thinking kind of in pragmatist terms and any kind of account of something in terms of interests, right? So I think you get a similar kind of fit between like evolutionary accounts of behavior and pragmatism, right? Where you're like, well, we evolved certain concepts in order to help our survival. That was our interest. Some of them might have matched up with how the world actually is. What good luck that was, but like probably they matched up with the world because matching up with the world was conducive to survival in the end, right? Dawkins' idea. Yeah, Dawkins might, and Jordan Peterson has an extreme kind of pragmatism about truth. Yeah, so I think the association there is if we're thinking about these ideologies as having developed in virtue of people having certain interests, then we're thinking kind of in pragmatist. And if we think that that's kind of good or justifiable in a sense, which I'm not sure that I do, but if we were to, then we would be thinking kind of in pragmatist terms about their kind of mental models and their conceptualization.
Right. And I think it also in some ways perhaps may explain why this is at once was a uniquely American phenomenon, and just like basically everything else produced by American culture is now being exported to the rest of the world.
Yeah. The spread of this stuff abroad, I think people have talked about this a lot with BLM style language being used to talk about racial issues in other countries. The Americanization, which is like, BLM is so, the rhetoric here is so caught up in America's specific racial history. The idea of exporting it is just like really confusing to me. I don't know the details. And of course, there's also this thing of China using kind of, in a way, woke language to explain why, like, American college students shouldn't be able to criticize the Chinese government and things like that, which is a whole different kind of, I don't know the details on that either. So I'm a bit outside my comfort zone talking about these things, but those are two things that are kind of on my radar of like weird ways in which the American kind of progressive education journalist industrial complex language has transmogrified to a certain extent.
Well, and it's particularly interesting, without jumping too far into the weeds. Well, we're all out in the weeds now, so I guess we'll just stay around and play in them. But the way that so much of this stuff is kind of like a variation on Rawls and his theory of justice, and sort of the necessity of having a perpetually oscillating manager to control the various distributions of things within the system. But the fundamental principle, like even that stands behind a Rawlsian, is that you may not necessarily deserve the things that you have, which is inherent in the language of privilege, has always been. It's not as though like social justice created that word. That's how people talked in the 18th century about, aristocrats. It's right. Part of that sort of language of our political inheritance. in some ways, perhaps that's a humorous pun there that, we've inherited privilege. What a privilege it is to have inherited the word privilege. What it also sort of underscores is the Calvinism in America that's so pervasive, and why it's what fascinates me on why is this being able to be transmitted, exported from America to these other places that have no concept of what a Puritan is.
Right.
Or Calvinism, any of this kind of stuff, predestination, any of this stuff, it's unintelligible to them in their culture. And yet somehow Americans exportation, good Lord, the way which we export our culture is so pervasive,
right,
that it's as if there's again, another one of these sweet ironies about being against colonialism and imperialism depends upon the exportation within a system that's colonial and imperial. That to get these ideas around, it's either idiosyncratic to your system, which may be true. I don't need to necessarily get into the argument on that per se, but if it is being exported and being utilized, it probably should at least make us think a bit about what are these underlying first principles that are animating these systems, even if they are, as we've sort of laid out, somewhat incoherent, or at least are producing incoherent arguments and results. Why has it been so easy, and this is the thing that keeps coming back to me on all of these questions, why has it been so easy for this stuff to move out of niche art critics and literary critics in the 1970s to now hearing where this is becoming instantiated in training things across all the corporations across the world? How did this happen in 40 or 50 years with these weirdly unique American hang-ups that come from alpinism? I don't know. I don't study this, but it's a constant source of fascination for me.
Yeah, I do think that there's, behind the materialist analysis that I gave, at least in the terms I gave it today, which were probably not the most illuminating, I think there's still a lurking question, which, there's still a question of why did these ideas gain any currency at all? Why did these ideas gain prestige at all? And why was it possible to convince people that being a good person would require these things? And that, I think, is you're talking about Calvinism, things like that. I just kind of have no idea. I do think, America, you get this confusion about American cultural products, even with sometimes you see, a movie that's not popular here, but was super popular in China and or India, and you wonder just what did they even get out of, what were they seeing that we weren't? What did they get out of this movie? What was so compelling to them about this movie? But of course, sometimes you say that about movies that are compelling here. You're why did everybody here, why did Avatar made $2 billion and everybody forgot about it? Who knows?
Right.
What did everybody like about Avatar? What was the whole thing there? I have no idea. So there's a certain sense in which some of these broad cultural movements are beyond my ken, and I don't know. I'm not an intellectual historian. There's a sense in which I don't even really understand the tools of intellectual history. I know the basic tool of reading old stuff, but and then connecting it to new stuff. But I don't understand what makes one connection better than another one. The connection of Calvinism to woke language and privilege, I do understand. There's a conservative view. I started thinking about it when you started talking about Rawls. I'm not one of them, obviously. There's lots of reasons why I can't be one of them, but I've made friends with some of the, and not just from being at Notre Dame, mostly from being on Twitter, but I've made friends with some of the kind of radical Catholic integralists, and they've introduced me to these kind of different sorts of genealogies of these ideas. So, there are people who think that the guild ideas this is just the working out of liberalism, right? You can just draw a straight line from Rawls to Robin DiAngelo.
Yeah.
And you can draw a straight line
almost
from
gets there.
Yeah, you can draw a straight line from Locke to Rawls. Some of them think you can draw a straight line from Duns Scotus or William of Ockham to Locke, and it starts all the way back with nominalism. I don't know about that, but I do find it funny, and people have fights about it in the philosophy department here. There's the whole ideas of consequences. I made a meme about that. I called it the 1319 project. Just my little joke. So Yeah, that's one way. That's one way that one could do the intellectual history. And I think some of them responded to my Guild article being like, well, these material factors are at play, but you have to understand the intellectual history if you really want to understand why these things became dominant. So I don't know. There's a lot that I don't know about what's going on and why it's going on. But I do think in the present moment, part of the fear around this stuff is scarcity of jobs, scarcity of social relationships, scarcity of clout on social media, and just if an Ivy League school trains you to do anything, it should be training you on how to be the one who gets the things in a time of scarcity, right?
To preserve elite status, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever that elite status becomes, to preserve it, or whatever form of elite status you're interested in.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add to it, and I don't know if I want to call this a perpetual flaw, but I'll call it a perpetual flaw, that I always want to be overly charitable to the people I'm criticizing. Mm-hmm. And so in this instance, people who are deeply animated by concerns of social justice, I assume that most of them are well-intentioned, at least the people who are doing the work, if I'm going to use the language. I think they are, and I would also tend to agree that there are certainly things that are worthy of such work. That it's not as though, I'm very much not a conservative, especially someone who goes, further to the right of, say, someone like Burke, where even Burke goes, things have to change over time. You have to make modifications. I'm not someone that would go so far as to say, this is fine. My sentiments don't lie there. But I certainly am a bit more sympathetic to tracing the historical legacy and how sort of through the dialectic that's developed through schools of philosophy well up into the early parts of the 20th century, until philosophy did its big reboot in the beginning of the 20th century. These ideas are in some ways just rehashing. I think about when our discussion we were having earlier about power and who's in power gets to determine as the fundamental gatekeeper who else gets the benefits. Like, again, Plato in the Republic, this is Thrasymachus. It's just Thrasymachus applied through the language of race and through power. I think that there's a lot to be said of postmodernism as a kind of return of sophistry. And I don't mean that as to denounce them. Only people, Platonists certainly are going to get all hot and bothered by it. But as I mean this, as people who are engaged in things that are far more based in language, less based in questions of capital T truth, again, because it's all coming from Nietzsche. But what this does to me, and like the last two questions that I have for you here, if you have a couple more minutes for me.
Yeah.
There are two questions fundamentally about education. And the first one is, what do you think the relationship is between activism and education? And then the second part of that is, what do you think that's the defining thing that characterizes this guild apparatus, is redefining what those two words are, or perhaps conflating them together?
Oh, wow. I mean, we could do a whole other episode on this question. I think that if the first question is meant to be, so I guess I simplified in my head, and I took the first question to be about what the proper relationship is, and the second question to be about what the actual relationship is. I just wrote a piece for Heterodox Academy so John Haidt at Heterodox Academy has this idea of the telos of the university as truth, and activism is kind of like threatening to that telos. I don't think that's exactly right. So my piece is just making a small distinction and saying, actually, the place where activism, I think, threatens the goals of education is not in people eventually saying untrue things, because that's always a danger, but it threatens what some philosophers have called intellectual achievements. So you can think of knowledge and understanding and explanation as intellectual achievements. The real problem is that, like, somebody like me, my view is that political reasons for believing some or another proposition are not ever really like the right sorts of reasons to justify that belief. So I think I believe in a very strong sense that if the things that cause people to believe the things that they learn in college are political causes, then they haven't in general made intellectual achievements in the course of their education. And in that sense, they haven't really gotten the right sort of education. So, for example, let's think about, something that I used to be really concerned with a few years ago when all the James Damore stuff was going on. Sex differences in interests or in cognition or something like that. So one reason somebody might believe that there aren't sex differences in cognition is if they've read a lot of the academic literature and they've found like statistical errors in it, or if they think it's like badly conceptualized, or if they think it has the wrong sorts of constructs or something like that, or if it doesn't have the right sort of causal mechanism. And then they could formulate a sort of argument, and they would have developed a sort of line of thought that is based on the right sorts of reasons for believing or disbelieving in this specific kind of proposition. Another reason you might come to believe that there aren't sex differences in cognition is if you think from a political basis and say, by and large, saying that there are sex differences leads to inequity. So believing in that proposition would make me like complicit in inequity or an inequitable person. And so I'm not going to believe in that proposition, right? So I have, in a sense, it's just like a doctrinaire view that I have, where the first kind of reason for believing in this, for believing that there aren't these sex differences is a good kind of reason, and the sort of reason that can ground an intellectual achievement. And the goal of the university, I think, is to help people to achieve things intellectually. Mm-hmm. And the second kind of reason is just not the sort of reason. Some epistemologists call this the wrong kind of reason problem, characterizing which kinds of reasons are right and wrong for believing which kinds of propositions. I just think in this very doctrinaire way that the political reason is not the sort of reason that can ground an intellectual achievement in believing that proposition. So even if you're right, so this is where I disagree with Haidt, even if it's true, it could be true, but there's a sense in which I don't really care, because the first kind of reason is the sort of reason that we're interested in developing people's appreciation for in the course of their education. And the second kind of reason is not, it shouldn't even be on our radar, in my view, the political reason for believing in that sort of proposition. So that's my view on the proper role. It's very like keeping things separate on my dinner plate sort of view that I sometimes have in philosophy, which is not my view about dinner, but it's my kind of the way my brain works, even not the way my stomach works. The actual role, I think, is a complex matter in a different way. I'm not sure how much I can say authoritatively about it. It's definitely the case that just like there's a prestige hierarchy of investment banking and law firms and med schools and things like that graduates of elite schools sometimes go to, there are also kind of prestige rankings of types of organizing you can do and of roles you can have within that organizing. I don't think that, I'm influenced enough now by the anti-identity politics left to say that it's not clear to me that there is definitely a pressure in elite schools to engage in activism, or at least to approve of activism. It's not clear to me that it is actually a pressure that leads people to like effective forms of activism, because it's not clear to me that guild organizing is like good organizing in terms of actually like achieving. It's not clear to me that like a guild-inflected political campaign. Actually, I think one of the lessons of the 2020 Democratic primary is like the conservatives are a bit like, they're like a bit too worried about this stuff, or worried about it in the wrong way, right? Because like all of the guildy candidates, right? All of the like the people who were in the election because they were black or female, or who made, like Gillibrand or Warren, who made like saying social justice crap like a big part of their appeal, they got smoked, right?
In some way. I mean, Warren did okay for a while, certainly.
Warren did okay for a while. I mean, Warren was leading for a while, but
Gillibrand certainly had a hard time from launch.
Gillibrand had a hard time. Julian Castro, didn't get like a broad base of Hispanic support. Cory Booker didn't get a broad base of black support and things like that. And in general, I don't think it ended up being the case that there was this big response of the electorate to social justice messaging put in Guild language. There's actually recently, just with the Democratic Convention, which I haven't been watching, and I hope for your sake that you haven't been watching either.
Watched every minute of it, actually.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. My condolences.
Yeah.
So you probably saw developing this discourse around Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's like 90-second thing where she threw out a lot of like, oh, we need to reimagine a world without like this and that, and like set like without patriarchy and xenophobia and like a bunch of like, you know, guilty buzzwords, right? So Jonathan Chait on Chait, I'm pronouncing it like it's Jonathan Haidt, but you know, the New York Mag guy, not the New York University guy. So Jonathan Chait made a tweet that was like, this speech sounds like it was written for graduates of elite colleges, basically, right? So basically what we've been talking about this whole time is what Chait was saying. And he got attacked for it. I don't remember why he got attacked. Probably a variety of things. Probably a lot of people were saying, oh, anybody can understand these things.
We probably got attacked because he said something.
Yeah, I mean, he gets attacked just for speaking,
just for speaking.
But I don't even know if I understand, you know, as somebody who's attended a lot of institutions, I don't know if I really understand what it means to reimagine or what AOC means by xenophobia in that context, or why these abstractions would be what to focus on. So I think it's an open question whether guild organizing and guild ways of speaking and things like that are actually effective political tools and are like actually have a good pride of place in an activist kind of rhetorical arsenal. I do think that, you know, the capture of institutional capture with political goals, I do think is a real phenomenon. So in that sense, you know, in my very cynical sense of like being a college activist might be a good way to get a job, not as an activist, but like a good way to get your foot in the door at like the New York Times or like Goldman Sachs or something, because it has a certain kind of prestige at the moment, and because there's pressure on these institutions to hire a certain number of people with activist backgrounds. That is sort of more what I think of as the relationship, at least at a very elite school, of education and activism as being. Is just like activism is part of, because we have this guild, activism doesn't train you to be an activist, it trains you to be a worker in a prestigious position and to maintain that position and to project your power.
So it's an interesting, the reason I asked the question, one is obviously I'm curious your reflection, but two, it allows me to ask the sort of follow-up, which is there's been a big push, and this has been true of universities in America, I mean, since forever. Well before we had the big restructuring at the end of the, you know, before we were granting PhDs, we were having this fight. Is the purpose of the university to produce elites that can talk to each other in elite language? Again, as we talked about earlier, you know, I can sit here and quote Locke to you, or now I can sit here and quote, you know, Ibram Kendi or whoever.
Right.
Or is it to be more like the foundation of most of the state universities in the country, to produce local workers for the local economy? So where I find the intersection between these questions to be difficult is if activism now becomes a means to the economy, as you're sort of indicating in your answer, then does that mean that the proper role of education, the thing that won out, is actually like the homestead type of universities? Like,
yeah, that's interesting.
Your technical schools, instead of it being the elite, where the elite universities think they're the ones guiding the ship, they're actually being driven around by the nose, and all you're really arguing about is the different kinds of gateway points to different kinds of jobs.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and in a way, you know, I'm a homer for the old-fashioned liberal arts ideal.
Yeah, same.
So in a way, you know, I'm not really an anti-elitist. You know, I learned ancient Greek in college, and I think everybody should learn like the basics of like all the stuff that I like, right?
Yeah, of course.
Everybody should leave college like understanding a bit of abstract algebra and classical music, and just like pick the other things that I like, and that's what I think people should be taught in college, because I think those are the good things, right? Plus a few things that I know nothing about, like art history, but
well, and you're in good company with that, though. I mean, that's the long tradition of liberal arts education is.
Yeah, I mean,
because those are the skills that are necessary for being a free person. Like, that's why they've been entrenched for. It wasn't just because of arbitrary blah blah blah. Like, there's a function that fundamentally stood behind them. If you wanted to be a free in the sense of having the ability to not just exist in your time, So there was and I guess that leads to the follow-up question, or a different one, to tag in, what is an elite and what's their purpose?
Wow, you're not going easy on me today. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons why people were a little bit critical of me using Turchin, because when Turchin uses the term elite, he doesn't just mean like a puffed up college graduate. He means somebody with like millions of dollars or something like that. Mm-hmm. And Turchin thinks that people like that have been overproduced. I guess I don't know. This is also this is something I remember from like the 2008 election where the McCain campaign called Obama elitist, and then people like me were like, oh, McCain has 7 houses. Like, how is that not? There's all these different forms of elite in America where that fight with each other. And it has a classic relationship to party politics where you have the cultural elites in the Democratic Party, and you have, well, I don't even know anymore which elites you have in the economic elites to a certain extent, I guess. And basically the cultural power of the left is so strong compared to its political and economic power. And that's why you get, that's why, in a sense, that's why I'm a conservative in the culture war. That's why somebody can be a conservative in the culture war, if they're a liberal or even a leftist in politics, I think, because the culture war starts from a place of such strength for the left. And that's something that I think a lot of leftists don't appreciate, that the culture war, as opposed to the economic and political struggles that are internal to the United States, is something where the left has just been crushing the right for decades and decades on every issue, or almost every issue. I can already anticipate the emails that I'll get.
But it probably actually helps explain the phenomenon you were describing earlier in the primary, that these benefits of being part of these upper echelon have not trickled down into the majority of the black population or the Latino population. They just haven't gone out there. And those places, those groups of people tend to be quite conservative personally, even if they tend not to be terribly politically.
And socially conservative in particular.
Right. And so that's where in a lot of these things, it's like a giant missed high five between people preaching their sermons about this and then the people in the congregation going, what book are you reading from?
Yeah, there's something so funny about people reading like Ibram Kendi and thinking that that's how they should run a political campaign to get black votes, and then just completely failing. There's just something. I feel a little bad for the people, but it's just so ludicrously funny to see campaigns like that fall on their faces.
Bad. But there was something, right?
Yeah, but there was something. I hadn't quite responded to your question. So you're talking about defining elites. I was saying there's all these different forms of elites.
And then what's their role?
And what's their role? I think the best I can speak to is the elite that I can't deny being. Everybody wants to these days. Nobody wants to be elite, right? I can't deny that I've been a member of the intellectual and academic elite just in virtue of the institutions I've attended and the relationships I have and the places I write and things like that. The role of the elite that I'm a member of, I think, should be to raise the level of public discourse and to articulate novel arguments and ideas, as well as to formalize and kind of make robust arguments and ideas that you see among kind of the folk. This is something that Elizabeth Anscombe thought, philosophy was supposed to do to a certain extent, that there's just, the arguments are kind of already out there and you find them. I think it was Anscombe. I never remember who said what. But there, a couple of views of philosophy. One of them is that the arguments are already out there and we just make them robust, and others is philosophy is more like math and you come up with your own. And there's a bit of truth to both of them. That is something that I don't think that we actually do. And if you look at the number of public intellectuals who are on Twitter and the way that they conduct themselves and the dunking and the topics, there's this joke. Have you seen this song, the WAP song? I'm not going to say what it's about, but
and Ben Shapiro's reaction to it.
Yeah, so Ben Shapiro had his reaction to it. So first of all, Ben Shapiro is also a member. Nobody will allow this, but Ben Shapiro is also a member of the intellectual and academic elite of the United States.
He graduated from Harvard Law School. How could he not be?
He graduated from Harvard Law School, and
Deeply influential
yeah.
in right-wing politics. I mean, how could he not be?
How could he not be? But, so he's, we could all do much better jobs. But there was this joke that was going around this song, about this song, that was like, it was just like a bunch of lyrics from the song, and then the joke was like, oh, you can see how in these lyrics, like Cardi B or whoever it is, like decontextualizes the eroticism of the body and, develops the semiotics of blah, blah, blah. And it's just like giving this like lit crit analysis of this completely ridiculous song. And that, I think, is the joke there. I take it, at least. Maybe this is imputing my own views on things, but the joke there is that, like, this is what a lot of the intellectual elite has been doing for a while now. And this, to me, is one of the most under-remarked upon elements of the postmodern condition, which is the breakdown of high and low culture, right? And I just think that, like, intellectual elites should not be trying to buttress Cardi B songs with their interpretations. They, if you like it, you can listen to it. I'm not going to police what people listen to, but don't intellectualize it. Intellectualizing non-intellectual things is like not really what we should be up to. We should be, dealing with the things that are actually good. So that's my elitist liberal arts view. We should be able to distinguish between the good things and the bad things, the good arguments and the bad arguments, the good culture and the bad culture. We shouldn't be, tweeting. We shouldn't be thinking of everything we do in talking to each other as some rhetorical move in, that we, a dog whistle, or that we kind of diagnose. We should be doing our intellectual tasks, honestly, I think.
So this is interesting. I think that this may be one of the few points of rub that we've actually come across, and this has been quite a healthy chat here. But I think this may be the first time where we actually may have an actual fundamental disagreement here. And I think that's because of my grounding in, say, Plato and Aristotle, who are fundamentally engaging in the first aspect of philosophy that you're talking about, taking up the arguments that are out there and fixing them, refining them. That sort of requires you to engage in the low culture and to participate in it. But where I think I'm not going to disagree with you on is you don't confuse it with the thing you're pursuing. Like, there's so very much an understanding that when you're out looking for things, you know what you're looking for, which presumes you already know what it is. And then you can use the thing to, this is very Platonic of me, but to use the thing to ascend up to that higher virtue.
Yeah, I actually think unfortunately, I don't think we disagree. So I think that, at least in terms of philosophy, we don't disagree. Maybe in terms of music criticism, we would disagree about the utility of Cardi B.
Yeah, we agree on that too.
Yeah, I try to do both in my work. But so, for instance, I wrote a paper, I have to go back to it at some point, about the idea that if you redefine a word, you sort of like remove the heft of it, right? You dilute it, or you water it down, or something, right, like that. So that's an idea that, just like, if you talk to the man on the street about changing the definition of the word racism, the man on the street, well, that's one of the ideas that he'll have, right? Or the woman on the street, right? They will say, oh, like, it feels like if you keep changing the definition, it doesn't have the same force. Like, you can't say what's bad anymore. And so I think of that as like very much that task of like taking, okay, this is something that like a normal person says. Now let me put it in philosophical terms. Let me make it a bit more rigorous. There's still a task for the intellectual. You don't just like transmit it, but it's basically sourced in the lower culture. And yeah, I have no problem with it.
So what that makes of interest to me, because the way that describes, Aristotle talks about this in terms of you don't want to change the law too often. Like, and I always think of it this way: if you change the speed limit out on this road 4 times in 4 weeks, you're going to catch a lot of speeders because you haven't properly habituated people to that rule. And I would think that the constant change in language is the same sort of thing. You're going to guarantee that people use it improperly if you're constantly changing its definition.
But now we come back to guild dynamics once again, right? Because what is the guild dynamic is just whoever habituates faster. And if the people who habituates the fastest, let's give them credit, people who went to Ivy League undergrads. They are the fastest habituators.
And this is why I think the question, we brought up Pinker's use of the euphemism treadmill, and I think this is such an interesting example of where I think the word elite might be the first one of these. because we use it as a euphemism to say best, also few, and also the wealthy. So in like saying the ancient way of thinking about politics is class-based. Like Marx didn't come up with it.
Right.
It goes all the way back, and the way that it breaks down is the rule of the few versus the rule of the many. And so which form is sort of driving it. American politics is not based on that, but that's a whole different seminar for something else. But
so do you think that Marx was an Aristotelian?
No, well, he didn't think he was. No. I think Marx was drawing upon like Hegel is drawing upon this stuff. Machiavelli draws upon it.
I was only asking because my housemate's thesis is that Marx was an Aristotelian, so I was curious.
Now I'd want to read that because he doesn't. Yeah. He very much does not see himself in that tradition. So I would be curious to see how he gets there. But no, Aristotle's point is that every city is going to be empirically comprised of the rich and the poor, the few and the many, and that politics oscillates between them. So what we have in some ways kind of done in our euphemism for the elite is we've taken out that sort of oligarchy, because that really inflames our democratic passions. That word pisses us off. And also the best, aristocracy, and squished them. And we called this elite by combining these various elements. And it seems in some ways what we have lost in the euphemism, sort of going back to our conversation on slogans, is what is the sort of the function of people who are in these privileged positions, whether it be in the best because you've accomplished it or the wealthy. And like the long sort of inherited tradition is that your job is to preserve the system that brought you to where you are. But you have to make it, but this is where I think a lot of conservatives get things wrong. And unless they're like smart Burkeans, to preserve it means to make it more stable.
Right.
So you have to improve it as you preserve it. That's to your interest. But it seems as though what we've sort of done now in the elite production in the country is say that, your task isn't really to preserve it, it's to transform it.
Right.
And by engaging in transformation, it actually then has to sort of undermine your position as an elite. Which I think here's where the Marxist criticism I think is perhaps would be the most fruitful or interesting. It's like, has the elite lost their class consciousness?
Right.
But then on the flip side, the thing we've talked about prior, is this just another example of elites trying to dominate the non-elites through this sort of guildmanship? And I think our discussion of postmodernism also sort of highlights why this is, we can't give a good answer to this because there's not a coherent thing at work here.
Right. I also think that, the other thing, everything you said was very interesting and right, I think. The other thing that came to me from what you were saying was, you were distinguishing between the wealthy and the best, right? You were saying that in the ancient world they made this distinction.
Well, Aristotle. I don't know the ancient world, but Aristotle does, yeah.
So I don't know if I don't think you can say that people are the best anymore. I don't think you're like allowed to. I think this is where I see the guild dynamics playing a lot, right? Because, so who would Aristotle would probably think that like, who's the best in America? Like, I don't know, like Elon Musk or something. I have no idea. Probably like, who knows? I have no idea. But I think that the idea of the guild, if we want to put it in those terms, is to be like, look, here, these are the best, right? This is the elite of, not necessarily of wealth, though, maybe eventually, but these are the best people, and you can tell by how they use language and how they are able to navigate progressive pieties and stuff like that. So I think that if somebody wanted to do an analysis of the elite, kind of building off of this guild idea, but thinking much more deeply than I have about what the word elite means and separating out these aspects, one starting place would just be like, this as maybe more of, in the ancient sense, the aristocracy, the group of people who are proving themselves to be the best. That's what aristos means, right? Yeah, because you get the kalos charistos, right? The beautiful and the good.
Yeah, the color. Yeah, and because arete, it means excellence. Yeah, the best.
Yeah. Yeah. So the aristoi. Yeah, I think the idea is that the aristoi are supposed to be the ones who perform, guild functions the most excellently.
And so this leads, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson have a really fascinating set of letters back and forth on this question. Two men who, by any account, are excellent in their own regard, not without their flaws. And even but that's one of those things. It's almost a naive sense that one can be excellent, also meaning perfect. No, they cannot be the same things. They cannot be the same. But they have this conversation about, in an egalitarian system, how do you have space for the people who are claiming to be the best? And if America is anything, it's a place dedicated to the principle of egalitarianism. Increasingly more, I mean, by the time we die, the country will be the most egalitarian it's ever been.
Right.
But it probably means that the people who are wanting to preserve their status as the best are going to have to go even more crazy. Because how do you make distinctions if you're trapped in this system? And that's, again, where I thought the guild thing was so interesting, because it points us to this. There's a fundamental market problem. There's an honor problem. And I think that's really, and I think that's where Aristotle is the most useful, probably of all the people in the past, because he thought so clearly or carefully about honor as a currency and its importance. Because what is the best? It's a designation of honor politically. Now, I think to sort of try to answer your question, what is the best? I think it's kind of doing stuff like we're doing, engaging in questions of big first principles and dedicating our life to this kind of stuff.
Well, I think we're actually the best. I don't know if people see us as the best.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'll let you claim that. I'm not doing that. But in terms of politics, who are going to be the people that are the best? There's a huge debate in the literature on this stuff, because it's not terribly clear. I like to think of it this way, and I think this is true of a lot of, until you get to philosophy as math. So after 1900, a lot of people say a lot of things, not terribly clear what they mean. The image that you brought up before of the elite, and perhaps this is a good way to end, is with the beginning of Hegel's philosophy of right. He talks about philosophers sitting at a mural with different colors of gray paint, painting on top of each other, arguing about the various shades of the gray that they're painting on this canvas of gray. And all the while what's going on behind them is history is moving. I'm not a Hegelian, but I think the image of that is this of sort of a trifling affair of arguing amongst elites about what it means to be elite and who better understands the color gray. And it makes me wonder how much of that is particularly at play here. If you can understand the 47 variations of gray, you get to be in the guild. If you think there are 44, get out, you loser. If that's a lot of what's going on here, that our euphemism of the elite doesn't know what it is, so the people it's producing don't know who they are, so they don't know what to do. But by God, we're not you schmucks.
Yeah, I do think at the end of the day that a lot of it is we're not you schmucks. I hadn't thought at all to. Now, I think the idea of an aristocracy is maybe even more motivated. Like, again, with the aristos in its real sense, is maybe even more compelling than the idea of a guild. So I have to think more about that.
And it's certainly, if they are aspiring to be one, it's not going to be an Aristotelian one.
Right.
No, actually, the other thing that's so interesting on this, because there, again, tying back to our question of rights and the Universal Declaration, the French thinker Alexis de Tocqueville, which nobody in philosophy departments reads, because he's like a kind of sociologist, kind of political scientist. He's a French guy in the 19th century. What are you going to do?
Right.
But he sort of lays out that you can backdoor Aristotle in by convincing people that acting virtuously is their right.
Right.
And then it becomes mine and I own it. But what we seem to be having sort of a fundamental disagreement on is the nature of how those rights are supposed to manifest. And I think that's where a lot of these, and maybe I'm wrong, again, I think you've reflected on this perhaps a bit more than I have, but there seems to be a lot of that sort of lack of self that's animating so much of this in the elites, because they don't know what they're doing or who they are. And I'm still constantly left with this question: why were the elite universities so susceptible to this? What is it about it? Again, was it their character that set them up, or was it the kind of people that they were bringing in, or is it, as you perhaps put, a materialist cause, that they were forced into this kind of lack of self-awareness by proximate causes? perhaps the future iterations of the two of us can have this conversation in a century, and they can answer that question for us.
Yeah, everything will become clear. I mean, who even knows what historians will think of what we're doing? I think being, as events unfold around me, I become more and more skeptical of accounts of the past, to be completely honest, because now I watch people writing about what's happening, and I think the historians are just like the journalists, and it's just a fight, not that I think there is an objective truth, but I think probably rarely gets transmitted. So who knows what they'll say about us in a century? They'll probably have some terrible name for us.
Bring it on.
Anyway.
Yeah. Hey, so thanks for coming on. This was really great. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed the conversations on this channel, please consider subscribing or supporting the channel more directly with the link in the description. And I hope you'll join me in the next episode.